The Cratchit family. Bob, his wife, and their 6 kids, which includes Tiny Tim. Just who are they, and how are they presented in Charles Dickens's novella, A Christmas Carol? Let's find out.
How's it going, Revision Squad? It is me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video we are going to have a think about the Cratchit family, so that's Bob Cratchit, his wife, and all their children, which of course includes Tiny Tim, and how they are all presented in Charles Dickens's novella, A Christmas Carol. These characters appear or are referenced in each of the story's staves, so you know what? They're probably quite important. As per usual, I will be analysing plenty of key quotations in this video, so make sure you grab a pen and some paper now so that you can take some notes. And of course, if you think this video is really helpful as you're watching it, why not drop it a like, write a comment to let me know, subscribe to my channel if you aren't already, or even share it with your friends, classmates and teachers. And hey, if you really think that absolutely everything I do on this channel is super useful, why not check out my Patreon, which you can find down in the video description, or at patreon.com/dystopiajunkie. If you are able to support me over there, that would be absolutely amazing, and I would appreciate it immensely. Oh, by the way, speaking of subscribers, at the moment, less than 30% of you who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you're in that 72.2% that you can see on screen right now, please do consider pressing that lovely red subscribe button. If all of you did that, I would basically be at 10,000 subscribers already. Anyway, just who are the Cratchits? Before we get stuck into analysing those quotations, it is definitely worth our time having a quick think about who they are first. Now, first of all, I think it is really important for me to say that the Cratchits are not frogs or pigs. We've all seen the brilliant movie. I mean, it's actually one of my favourite movies of all time. But please, do not ever write in your essays about how Bob is a frog or how Mrs. Cratchit is a pig. I've seen so many students do this in their school books or practice essays, and I even know a couple that actually wrote it in their exams as well. And yeah, it doesn't go down well. Don't do this ever. Please. With that out of the way, I guess we can turn our attention to just who the Cratchits actually are. So, if we consider them as characters, we could say that they are a family of 8 made up of a husband and wife and their 6 children, one of whom is disabled. You would also probably want to include the fact that they are poor and the fact that Bob Cratchit works for Scrooge. There's not really loads else that you could say here, I think, apart from maybe the fact that they love each other very, very much. Now, if we want to think about their story role, that's where things start to get a bit more interesting. So, I think that simply by virtue of being present in the story as somewhat developed characters, Dickens humanises the impoverished through his portrayal of the Cratchits. Basically, he presents the poor as being people, which they of course very much are, but someone as wealthy, narrow-minded and uncaring as Scrooge would not necessarily see this. Furthermore, because their lives are quite difficult and because Tiny Tim dies what is ultimately an avoidable death, Dickens's portrayal of the Cratchit family allows him to demonise poverty as well as those who maintain it. Basically, by showing poverty to be a bad thing, Dickens more or less suggests that the people who keep the poor impoverished are bad people. Finally, in showing just how much of a great time the Cratchits have over Christmas, as seen most emphatically by how much they value their Christmas dinner, Dickens highlights the importance of Christmas to the poor. But of course, we can think more deeply still. Can we interpret the Cratchits as a symbol, metaphor, or representation for something or someone else? Well, of course we can. Simply put, I think that the Cratchits can be seen to represent the working class at large. Their experience is typical of the working class during the Victorian era. Money is tight, their family is large, and they come to know illness and death quite well. In showing the difficulties experienced by the working class, Dickens may have hoped to increase his wealthy readership's sympathy towards the poor and transform general attitudes towards the impoverished. Furthermore, some critics argue that Tiny Tim may have been inspired by Dickens's own nephew, who was also sickly. I discussed that connection in greater detail in my 5 Facts About Dickens video, so if you want to find out more about this, head over to that video. Anyway, that's who the Cratchits are, but which quotations might we discuss in order to analyse them? Alright, so before I get stuck into analysing some quotations, I just wanted to remind you that all of the page references in this video, as well as this series at large, refer to this book, A Christmas Carol and Other Christmas Writings, which was published by Penguin. If you have a different copy of the story, the odds are that our page numbers won't match, but I hope that I make it pretty clear whereabouts you will find each quotation in the story. Anyway, to start with, we are going to focus on Bob Cratchit, and in particular how he is presented in the first stave. In describing him, Dickens writes, "The clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed." Now, I reckon that this quotation presents Bob Cratchit as being quite pitiable, as he fails to warm himself at the candle, and so you're bound to feel a bit sorry for him, right? Not necessarily because he cannot get warm, but because he is forced to work in quite an unpleasant environment. Furthermore, because Bob tries to warm himself at a candle, something that we all know isn't really going to warm him up loads, we could also get the impression that he is a meek character, as he hasn't the courage to ask his boss for a greater source of warmth. Now, it isn't just this quotation where we might see Bob as being pitiable and meek. You see, when he approaches his boss and the two of them discuss the possibility of Bob taking Christmas Day off, and being paid for it no less, we see that Scrooge is quite a gruff and cold boss, which might make us pity Bob. However, what is more interesting is that in the additional quotation that is now on screen, Bob does not actually have a voice. He has no dialogue. First he smiles, and then his speech is reported. As such, he seems somewhat subservient to Scrooge, and certainly much less powerful, which could also add to the general impression that Bob is meek and pitiable. We're now going to have a quick think about Tiny Tim. Somewhat counterintuitively, I would like to first focus on one of the additional quotations that centre on him. You see, when Dickens first introduces the boy, he writes, "Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame." At a surface level, this quotation makes his disability really clear, and the alas and exclamation mark at the end of it suggest that it is quite unfortunate that Tiny Tim is disabled. However, Tiny Tim's illness and disability also enables him to become a symbol of poverty and class disparity. You see, although Dickens never actually outright confirmed what Tiny Tim's condition exactly was, the conditions that critics generally suggest that he suffered from either rickets or renal tubular acidosis, were actually treatable in Dickens's time, provided that you could afford the treatment, that is. But they were also fatal if left untreated. Now, turning our attention to the main quotation for this slide, we learn more about Tiny Tim by paying attention to Bob Cratchit's dialogue. Speaking to his wife, he tells her how he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Haha. Firstly, this tells us that Tiny Tim does not pity himself. He acknowledges that he is, in his own words, a cripple, but rather than feeling sorry for himself, he hopes that his presence might bring others comfort and joy, as he might, in a roundabout way, remind them of Jesus. Indeed, by thinking of the Bible's teachings, we see that Tiny Tim is a good Christian. Throughout the story, Dickens seems to suggest that following Christian teachings leads to becoming a good person, and this also seems to be the case of Tiny Tim, who is perhaps the purest character in the entire story. Tiny Tim being a good person is of course seen elsewhere in the story. When he announces at the Cratchit Christmas dinner, "God bless us, everyone," which is repeated at the very end of the story, I think that Tiny Tim is presented as being kind and generous and, yes, a good Christian. You see, he could have just exclaimed, "God bless us," which would have meant that he was asking for God's blessings on his entire family. However, because he attaches everyone to his exclamation, Tiny Tim is in fact expressing that he wishes for God's blessings to extend not only to his family, but to the entirety of humanity, irrespective of whether they are a man, woman, or child, rich or poor, or kind or mean-spirited. In asking for God's blessings to be applied to everyone, Tiny Tim appears to be very kind and generous, because he shows unwavering compassion towards humanity. Okay, so far we have considered the initial presentations of Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim. What can we say though about the Cratchits more generally across the rest of the story? So, our next quotation comes from Dickens's description of Mrs. Cratchit, which occurs in stave 3 just before Bob and Tiny Tim arrive. He writes that she is dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown. Simply put, this shows that the Cratchits are poor, because Mrs. Cratchit's gown is twice turned. To turn a garment in the Victorian times meant unstitching bits of fabric, turning them inside out, and then sewing them back in where they came from. The rationale for doing this was so that people could hide where their clothes were starting to wear thin or where they had got stained, which generally made them last a bit longer. However, because Mrs. Cratchit had turned her gown twice, the outward-facing fabric is already likely to be thinned and stained. It was on the outside when she bought it. It got thin or stained, so she turned it and it was on the inside. But then the new outside also got thin or stained, and so she turned it again, and the original outward-facing fabric is back on the outside again. Clearly, the Cratchits cannot afford new clothing if Mrs. Cratchit has to turn her garments out twice. Now, the Cratchits being poor and impoverished is of course seen loads of places in the story. Because Peter, the oldest Cratchit boy, is seen in a monstrous shirt collar, which we are told belongs to Bob, we see that the Cratchits are poor because Peter has to wear his father's hand-me-downs rather than wearing his own clothes. When Bob arrives wearing threadbare clothes, the impression that the family cannot afford new articles of clothing is reinforced. Furthermore, because the cheapness of their Christmas dinner is a theme of universal admiration, we see that the Cratchits value a bargain, primarily because they cannot afford many luxuries, if any at all. Now, you could just say that the Cratchits are impoverished or poor and leave it at that. However, I think we can develop the idea in a more interesting way. You see, their Christmas dinner was eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, making it a sufficient dinner for the whole family. The phrase eked out in this context means to stretch out or to bulk up or just to make seem bigger. And so we get the impression that the main elements of the Christmas dinner were fairly unsubstantial, but that the Cratchits made it seem more plentiful by incorporating vast quantities of applesauce and mashed potatoes, food items that were relatively cheap to produce. As such, we could say that whereas the Cratchits are impoverished, they are also quite resourceful, and they are making do with the little that they have. The Cratchits being resourceful and making do is of course seen elsewhere in the story. You see, as much as Mrs. Cratchit wears a twice-turned gown, it is also brave with ribbons, a phrase that reveals that she has decorated her clothes with thin and cheap bits of fabric, both to cover up any holes or stains, but also perhaps to make it just more pretty. Furthermore, after their Christmas dinner, the Cratchits were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time, revealing that although their Christmas celebrations were hardly grandiose, they were certainly appreciative of what they did have, again showing that whereas they may be impoverished, they are making do with what they do have. We also get the impression that the Cratchits are a tight-knit, loving family. Now, one place where we might get this impression is when Dickens writes in Stave 3, Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, Master Peter mashed the potatoes, Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce, Martha dusted the hot plates. In detailing all of the activities that the Cratchit family perform as they prepare their dinner, using one long list, Dickens suggests that they are cooperative and are a solid team, which I think suggests that they are tight-knit and loving, as they are supporting each other and are doing all they can to ensure that their Christmas dinner is as perfect as it can be. Elsewhere we see that the family is tight-knit and loving because Mrs. Cratchit greets her daughter by kissing her a dozen times when she arrives at the family home. This is quite emphatic and almost a little over the top, but you know what, I think it seems appropriate given the enormity of the family's love for one another. Now, of course, the two examples that I have discussed so far are positive examples of where the family's love is shown, and you could just go ahead and discuss those two quotations and, you know what, do a decent job. But I always think it's important
to consider
the same idea from multiple angles. Are there, for instance, any examples of the family's love being shown that are not exactly positive? Of course there are. When Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come visit the Cratchit household in Stave 4, one of the first details we are told is that it is quiet. Very quiet. We do of course know that in this future Tiny Tim has died, and so this completely flat and sombre atmosphere, which contrasts heavily with the general liveliness and energy of the household in Stave 3, shows just how distraught the family members are to have lost one of their own. Love is not only seen in positive emotions. Grief and loss, yeah, they're negative emotions, but they are also tied up in with love. This is perhaps best seen in Bob Cratchit's appearance in Stave 4, because when he arrives home, he openly sobs and weeps and breaks down. Bob is pitiable in this quotation, for sure, but this quotation also shows that the strength of his love for his dead son is so overwhelming that he is unable to put on a brave face for his wife and children. Indeed, the repetition of little and frequent use of exclamation marks suggests that Bob is utterly beside himself. He can barely comprehend that his son has gone, and clearly he feels that Tiny Tim was taken too soon. Whereas the simple declarative sentence, "he couldn't help it," explains how Bob's feelings of loss have burst out of him like a dam that cannot hold any more water. So, it turns out that the Cratchit family are incredibly close then. But remember, this can be seen in both positive and negative emotions, and a discussion of both sides may be key to you achieving the top grades. Next up, let's look at Bob and Mrs. Cratchit's dialogue as they make a toast in stave 3. Dickens writes, "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon." Now, I've picked out this quotation for one of our key quotations for the Cratchits, as I think the clash between Bob and his wife is quite interesting. You see, in toasting Scrooge, Bob acknowledges that their Christmas dinner, or feast, is thanks to Scrooge, given that it is the miser who pays his wages. It may be a fairly meagre dinner, but the fact that they have a Christmas dinner at all is something that Bob sees as being worth celebrating, and so too is the fact that Bob's actually allowed to be there on Christmas Day. Here, Bob's subservience and gratitude is representative of the members of the working class who are downtrodden, defeated, and have accepted their lowly position in society. On the other hand, you could just say that Bob is grateful to be employed and granted the day off work, with payment no less, a position which many of his fellow man would not have been so fortunate to find themselves in. On the other hand, we have Mrs. Cratchit's response to Bob's toast. Her opening exclamation is clearly sarcastic. She does not see Scrooge as the founder of the feast at all, and clearly does not see him to be someone worth celebrating on Christmas Day, given that she would like to give him a piece of her mind to feast upon. Her anger and dislike of Scrooge is also seen by how her face reddens. Rather than being a subservient, compliant and grateful member of the working class, it seems that Mrs. Cratchit is a member of the working class who can see the rampant injustice and inequality of her existence, and is someone who is not prepared to just accept her fate. Now, I won't be analysing any additional quotations for this idea, but I think what we have on screen now is still worth thinking about in a bit more detail. You see, the fact that the husband and wife duo clash in this way is really useful for us to think about. As I said earlier in this video, Dickens's portrayal of the Cratchits allowed him to humanise the impoverished, because he has shown that they are real people, not just a faceless mass. By showing that members of the working class have different attitudes towards their situation, Dickens's humanising of them is strengthened because he has created the impression that they are not all exactly the same. In making his impoverished characters seem as close to real people as possible, Dickens may have encouraged his largely middle and upper class readership to more strongly sympathise with the poor and consider if their way of living is really all that fair. One of the last things that I would like to consider is how the Cratchits respond to ideas relating to social mobility. For those of you who don't know, social mobility is the idea that we can change our social status over the course of our lives, usually in a positive upwards direction. Obtaining greater wealth, securing more prestigious employment, and becoming more educated are all ways in which people can improve their social status. So, how is this relevant to the Cratchits? Well, in stave 4, we see the following exchange between Bob Cratchit, one of his daughters, and his eldest son, Peter. Dickens writes, "And then," cried one of the girls, "Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself." "Get along with you," retorted Peter, grinning. "It's just as likely as not," said Bob. Now, I'm aware that some of this dialogue might need translating, so bear with me. Peter's sister suggests that he will soon become a business partner to some connection that Fred, Scrooge's nephew, has supplied him with, which might eventually lead to Peter setting up his own business. Peter's response, "Get along with you," is sort of like a "stop messing around," or "don't get too carried away," or "drop the subject." And so at face value, his words suggest that he doesn't quite believe that such a future is possible for him. And yet his action, the fact that he grins as he says this, reveals that, at the very least, he likes the idea of becoming somebody's business partner and possibly even setting up his own business one day. Bob's dialogue, "it's just as likely as not," is pretty straightforward, I think. He's telling his son that the future could indeed happen. Why not? In this dialogue then, it seems that the Cratchit family all, at the very least, entertain the idea that they can achieve more in life, and that they will not necessarily live a life of struggle for the rest of their days. Just like Mrs. Cratchit only moments earlier, the rest of the family seem aware of the injustices that their lives bring them, and are motivated to climb the social ladder in order to leave these difficulties behind. However, just how much does Bob really believe that he will be able to leave a life of poverty behind? You see, in Stave 5, when Scrooge offers to raise Bob's salary, Bob had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with the ruler, holding him and calling to the people in the court for help and a straight waistcoat. In short, Bob thinks Scrooge is mad, as seen by how he wants help and a straight waistcoat, so a straitjacket. If Bob really believed that he was able to be socially mobile, would he have had this reaction? You know, Scrooge has just offered him more money. Is Bob really likely to go on the defensive and almost try to attack his boss? Or does his reaction just show how shocked he is that it is Scrooge who has been the one to offer him this escape route? Regardless, I think that there is a degree of disbelief here, and it makes me wonder if Bob's comment in Stave 4 that Peter being socially mobile is just as likely as not, is not, it turns out, intended to encourage his son, but is instead provided as a warning that escaping poverty's clutches is in fact an incredibly difficult thing to achieve. In short, the Cratchits' attitudes towards social mobility is either something that you see as providing great hope, or something that you see as being indicative of the deeply entrenched social injustices of the Victorian era. You're cool. Finally, I just want to consider how Bob is named throughout the story. You see, throughout Stave 1, Bob is not named. He is called the Clerk. Not Bob, not Mr. Cratchit, not Bob Cratchit, just the Clerk. Yet in Stave 3 onwards, his name is used to refer to him instead. Why has Dickens done this? Simply put, I think it was because he wanted to show how Scrooge was increasingly seeing Bob as a human being, not just his employee. It is here, I think, that Dickens's humanisation of the impoverished is shown, because he has given them a real personality and identity. It's very subtle, this shift in naming, and yet its effect is enormous. If Scrooge can see how the poor are real people as well, what's stopping Dickens's readers from doing the same? Okay, so that is the analysis of all of those quotations over. So how could we summarise the Cratchits in just a couple of sentences? Well, you could say, despite being impoverished, the Cratchit family make do and show each other a lot of love and support. The family have different personalities. Bob is meek and downtrodden, Mrs. Cratchit refuses to accept that their lives have to be this way, and Tiny Tim, he is kind-hearted and thoughtful. Now, as I said earlier on in the video, the Cratchits are a super important group of characters. Certainly, their presence in the story, Tiny Tim's in particular, is what largely inspires Scrooge to change his ways. So because they are super important, you might find it useful to get down some of the ideas from this summary. They will help you loads if you are asked to write about the Cratchits, and several of the descriptive words in that summary could prompt you to write analytical paragraphs. So, I don't know, you're welcome. And before the video ends, I would like to leave with a quick question for you to reflect on. Some people argue that it is the Cratchits, Bob and Tiny Tim in particular, who are the main characters of A Christmas Carol, rather than Scrooge. Why might they make this claim? Do whatever you want with that question. Make a mind map, chat with your classmates about it, use it as a title for an essay, and so on. You are also, of course, welcome to pop down any ideas that you might have in response to this question down in the comments section. I really do enjoy seeing what you lot come up with, and I'm usually pretty good at responding to your comments too. So if you give me some ideas, or even like a short analytical paragraph, you're even going to get a bit of feedback from me. And there we go. That is my analysis of the Cratchits complete. I really do hope that this video has helped you out in some way. Whether you are revising for exams, studying A Christmas Carol for the first time, or, just have a passing interest in Charles Dickens's writing. If you want to show your support and appreciation, well, I'm sure you know what to do. Anyway, as ever, I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student. Which, well, that's what you deserve to be.
So the Cratchit family. They may be poor, but that does not totally define who they are. You see, Bob might be meek and pitiable, Mrs. Cratchit might be frustrated by the injustices of poverty, and Tiny Tim's illness and death may well be directly caused by the family's impoverished state. But more than anything else, the family is shown to share an immense amount of love. They may be financially poor, but in terms of love, I don't think you could get any richer.